On the 14th of December, 1878, in the new palace in Darmstadt, the curtains had not been opened in weeks. The rooms smelled of carbolic acid and fever. Princess Alice of Hesse, third child of Queen Victoria, lay in a bed she had barely left for days, her body failing from the same diphtheria she had spent the past month nursing in her children. Her youngest daughter, Marie, was already dead, buried 3 weeks earlier, at 4 years old. Her surviving children were scattered through the palace in various stages of recovery. Her husband had only just risen from his own sickbed. Alice was 35. She had been a nurse since she was 18, since the night she'd held her father's hand as he died at Windsor, on this same date 17 years ago. Now, in the gray hours of a German winter morning, the woman who had spent her adult life sitting at other people's bedsides became the person others sat beside. She did not recover. That date, the 14th of December, had already claimed the man who built this family. Now it had claimed the daughter most devoted to his memory. Behind the public image of Queen Victoria's 9 children, the photographs at Osborne, the marriages into the courts of Europe, the golden promise of a domestic monarchy admired across the world, there was a private story the public never fully saw. A story of grief hardening into control, of children raised to carry a dead man's standards, and of a bloodline that carried something else entirely. This is the story of all 9 of them, from the eldest daughter sent to reshape Prussia, to the youngest held captive by her mother's loneliness, from the heir who waited 60 years for trust to the son whose body would not let him live. 9 children, 4 decades, and a family asked to survive inside one death that never ended. But to understand how it came to this, how a woman who had once presided over the most photographed family in Europe could find herself, at 59, receiving word of another child dying on the same date that had already broken her life in half, you have to go back. Not to the crown, not to the empire, not to any of the public or architecture that made the name Victoria synonymous with an age. You have to go back to a house on the Isle of Wight, to a marriage that reinvented what a royal family was supposed to look like, and to 9 children who were raised inside an idea of perfection that none of them, in the end, could survive. This is the story of Queen Victoria's children, all 9 of them, from the golden years at Osborne to the sick rooms and exiles and silences that followed. It is a story about what happens when a family built on love loses the person who designed it, and what the survivors owe to a ghost who never stopped setting the standard. The public version of the family was, for a time, the most successful piece of domestic propaganda in British history. Victoria and Albert did not simply rule. They performed something new, a monarchy organized around the idea of the family itself. The Queen was a wife. The Prince Consort was a father. The children were visible, numerous, and presented to the nation as evidence that the crown was not merely powerful, but morally serious. In an era still close enough to the memory of George IV's debts and mistresses to feel the need for distance, the royal household under Albert's direction became a kind of public argument. That authority and domesticity were the same thing, that the best ruler was also the best parent, and that the private life of the sovereign was the nation's business precisely because it was so admirably conducted. The vehicle for that argument was Osborne House, purchased in 1845 on the Isle of Wight as a retreat from the formal machinery of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Albert, who had a restless, improving mind and a need to shape everything he touched, helped design the house and its grounds. He laid out the gardens. He supervised the construction of the Swiss cottage, a miniature working household where the children would learn to cook, to garden, to keep accounts, to collect botanical specimens, and to behave as though usefulness were the highest royal virtue. The children had their own plots of earth. They grew vegetables. They were paid for their produce at market rates and expected to keep the books. It was, in its way, a small factory of character. Affectionate, certainly, but also systematic. Albert believed that royal children, left to the ordinary indulgences of rank, would become ordinary failures. He intended something harder and better. There were 9 of them, born across 17 years, and even in childhood, the differences were sharp enough to feel like prophecy. Victoria, the Princess Royal, called Vicky by the family, arrived first on the 21st of November, 1840. She was brilliant. That is not hagiography. It is what everyone who encountered her reported. She absorbed languages the way other children absorbed nursery rhymes. She read widely, argued confidently, and possessed an intellectual seriousness that delighted Albert in a way none of his other children quite managed. She was his favorite, and everyone knew it. What Vicky wanted, from the earliest age anyone could identify a want in her, was to be taken seriously, to inhabit a life equal to the size of her mind. She would get the life. Whether it was equal to the mind is a different question. Albert Edward, Bertie, came next, on the 9th of November, 1841, and the trouble began almost immediately. Not because Bertie was bad, because Bertie was not Vicky. He was not scholarly. He was not naturally disciplined. He was sociable, restless, physically energetic, and alive in ways the household often treated as problems to be corrected rather than qualities to be enjoyed. By the age of 7, his parents had commissioned a report on his educational progress that read less like an assessment than a diagnosis. By 11, he had been separated from his siblings and placed under a program of individual instruction so relentless that his tutors themselves occasionally questioned its wisdom. What Bertie wanted was approval, the simple, uncomplicated knowledge that his parents saw him as he was and found that sufficient. What he received instead was comparison. Comparison to Vicky. Comparison to Albert's ideal. Comparison to a standard that had been designed with great care to produce someone Bertie was never going to be. Princess Alice, born on the 25th of April, 1843, occupied the emotional center of the family almost from the start. She was gentle, perceptive, and possessed of a temperament so even that she became the person everyone turned to when the household's considerable tensions needed managing. She got along with Vicky without competing with her. She understood Bertie without judging him. She moved through the family like a current of calm, and the role suited her, or appeared to, because she was good at it, and because nobody thought to ask whether the peacemaker also needed peace. What Alice wanted was companionship, real companionship, an intellectual and emotional life shared with someone who would meet her where she stood. That want would define her marriage, her work, and eventually the manner of her death. Prince Alfred, born in 1844, was the second son and the first of the children to build an identity around motion. He entered the Royal Navy young and took to it with a directness that suggested he had always known the household's drawing rooms were not large enough. He would travel farther than any of his siblings, see more of the world, and carry less of the domestic weight. But distance, as several of Victoria's children would discover, was not the same as freedom. Princess Helena, born in 1846, was practical, tough, and less obviously glamorous than her elder sisters. She would become the daughter of duty, the one who stayed close, who served, who channeled her energies into nursing institutions and charitable organizations with a quiet, grinding competence. Princess Louise, born in 1848, was the family's artist and its nearest thing to a rebel. She drew, sculpted, studied formally, rode early, and carried herself with a wit and independence that sat uneasily inside the household's expectations for daughters. Prince Arthur, born in 1850, was Victoria's favorite son, obedient, military-minded, content to inhabit the role prepared for him. He would become, in many ways, the child for whom the system worked, which made him the exception rather than the rule. And then there were the two who would pay the highest prices. Prince Leopold, born on the 7th of April, 1853, was intellectually gifted, curious, and hungry for a life of the mind. He was also hemophiliac. The condition was not well understood, but its effects were brutally clear. A child who bruised at a touch, who bled from minor injuries in ways that could not be stopped, whose body made every ordinary adventure a medical event. Leopold wanted what any bright, restless young man wanted: independence, experience, a life not organized around the constant terror of his own fragility. Victoria wanted him safe, which increasingly meant Victoria wanted him still. Princess Beatrice, born on the 14th of April, 1857, was the baby. She arrived last, was adored, and grew up inside a tenderness that would, in time, become indistinguishable from captivity. But that story belongs to a later chapter, to the years after 1861, when adoration stopped being a gift and became a sentence. There is something worth understanding about the family in its intact years, before the fracture that changed everything. The children at Osborne were not unhappy, or not only unhappy. They swam, they collected shells, they acted in plays, they had ponies and dogs, and the Swiss cottage and the sea. The photographs from this period, and there are many, show a family arranged with a care that is partly stagecraft and partly genuine warmth. Albert upright and serious, Victoria small and watchful, the children fanning outward in order of age and height. These are among the first royal images to be widely reproduced, and they did exactly what they were designed to do. They made the monarchy look like a family, and the family look like a virtue. But the construction was tighter than it appeared. Albert's educational regime was not merely ambitious, it was comparative. The children were measured against one another and against their father's expectations, and those expectations did not flex. Vicky's brilliance became the standard by which Bertie's struggles were judged. Alice's emotional intelligence was valued, but never quite seen as the equal of intellectual achievement. The younger children grew up watching these dynamics and learning from them, learning who was praised, who was corrected, who was compared to whom, and what kind of person this household rewarded. The first great deployment came in 1858 when Vicky married Prince Frederick of Prussia. She was 17 years old. The match had been Albert's design, a liberal Prussian prince wedded to a brilliant English princess. The two of them intended to steer Germany toward constitutional government and British-style reform. It was dynastic chess played with a living daughter, and the fact that Vicky and Frederick genuinely loved one another did not change the underlying transaction. A child raised at Osborne was being sent to Berlin to become an instrument of her father's foreign policy. She went willingly, even eagerly. She believed in the project. But the viewer should feel, even here, the particular cruelty of a family that fused love and utility so completely that the children could not always tell the difference. By 1860, the family's public architecture was as solid as it would ever be. 9 children, a marriage admired across Europe, the Swiss cottage and its vegetable gardens, the photographs and the moral seriousness and the expanding web of continental alliances. Vicky was in Prussia. Alfred was preparing for the Navy. Bertie was being groomed, with increasing anxiety, for a future that everyone discussed and no one quite trusted him with. Alice was approaching the age of marriage. The younger children were still at home, still inside the machinery their father had built. And then, in the autumn of 1861, 2 things happened that would rearrange every life in the family. The first was a letter. In November, Victoria and Albert learned that Bertie, stationed at the Curragh military camp in Ireland, had been involved with a young actress named Nellie Clifton. The details had circulated through society. The humiliation was not merely private, but semi-public. Albert, already unwell, was shattered, not only by the scandal itself, but by what it represented. His son, the heir, the boy he had tried for 20 years to shape into something worthy of the throne, had done exactly the thing Albert most feared. He had behaved like an ordinary, undisciplined young man. Albert wrote Bertie a letter of devastation. Victoria's fury was colder and would last longer. The second thing was Albert's body. He had been ill for weeks, possibly longer, with symptoms that worsened through November and into December. On the 14th of December, 1861, at Windsor Castle, Prince Albert died. He was 42 years old. Alice, 18, had been at his bedside through the final days, nursing him with a steadiness that would define the rest of her life. Victoria's grief was immediate, total, and would prove, in its way, permanent. What followed was not simply mourning, it was a reformation. The household did not recover from Albert's death. It reorganized around it. Victoria withdrew into a seclusion so complete that it alarmed her ministers and bewildered the public. She wore black. She preserved Albert's rooms. She kept his belongings as he had left them. and she turned the family into a living memorial, a household in which every decision, every standard, every expectation was measured against what Albert would have wanted, spoken as though Albert were still in the room, and enforced by a widow whose grief had hardened into something that looked from the outside like authority and felt from the inside like a door that would never open again. The children still had their titles. They still had their prospects. They still had one of the most famous surnames in Europe. What they no longer had was a mother who could let them go. Each child absorbed the loss differently, and the differences would shape the next 40 years. Alice, who had held her father's hand through the worst of it, who had stood in the sick room when others could not bear to enter, became the daughter most associated with Albert's death, and therefore the daughter most bound to its memory. She was 18 years old, and what she had done in those final days was not simply nursing. It was a kind of audition, though she did not know it, for the role Victoria would assign her. The child who could be relied upon. The child who stayed. The child whose steadiness proved she understood what had been lost. In the weeks after Albert's death, Alice became her mother's closest support. Reading to her, sitting with her, absorbing the weight of a grief so consuming that it left little room for Alice's own. Vicky, in Berlin, received the news at a distance that made everything worse. She had been Albert's intellectual companion, his favorite, the child he had shaped most deliberately in his own image. Now she was 1,000 miles away, pregnant, embedded in a foreign court, and unable to reach her mother in the way Alice could. The loss was not only of her father, but of her position within the family's emotional architecture. Alice was present. Vicky was not. That asymmetry would harden into something neither sister fully recovered from. Bertie carried the heaviest and least speakable burden. Victoria did not merely grieve Albert. She blamed Bertie for hastening his death. The Nellie Clifton affair, coming in the weeks before Albert's final collapse, had fixed itself in Victoria's mind as a causal chain. Bertie's behavior had distressed Albert. The distress had weakened him. The weakness had killed him. The medical reality was almost certainly more complicated, but Victoria was not interested in medical nuance. She was interested in a story that explained why the center of her life had been taken from her, and Bertie was the explanation she chose. He was 20 years old. He would spend the next 4 decades trying to prove himself to a mother who had decided, on some level she never fully revisited, that he was responsible for the worst thing that had ever happened to her. The younger children, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, Beatrice, lost not only a father, but the counterbalance to their mother's intensity. Albert had been the household's architect, but he had also been its moderator, the parent who could absorb Victoria's emotional extremes and translate them into something more measured. Without him, the children faced Victoria directly, and Victoria, consumed by grief, was not a parent who could modulate her needs to match theirs. She needed them close. She needed them obedient. She needed them, above all, to understand that the household's organizing principle was no longer improvement or ambition or even love. It was remembrance. Beatrice was 4 years old. She would grow up inside that principle, as though it were the air itself. The first visible consequence was Alice's wedding. On the 1st of July, 1862, barely 6 months after Albert's death, Alice married Prince Louis of Hesse at Osborne House. The ceremony was held, as the Royal Collection Trust records it, in the strictest privacy. The room was decorated, but the atmosphere was closer to a funeral than a celebration. Victoria attended in mourning dress. The Archbishop of York officiated. The family stood in a space designed for joy, and felt the absence of the man who should have given the bride away. Alice, who had spent the previous 6 months as her mother's emotional crutch, was now leaving, and Victoria experienced her departure not as a natural transition, but as a second bereavement. A daughter who had proved her loyalty by staying was now proving her disloyalty by going. That pattern, staying as proof of love, leaving as a form of betrayal, would govern Victoria's relationship with her children for the rest of her life. It was not a policy she articulated in those terms. It was something worse, a feeling she could not examine, operating beneath every interaction, shaping every negotiation over marriage and duty and distance with the force of an unspoken law. The years that followed scattered the children across Europe like seeds thrown into separate weathers, and the harvests were as different as the soils. Bertie married Princess Alexandra of Denmark on the 10th of March, 1863, and the marriage was, in many respects, a success. Warm, socially brilliant, and anchored by Alexandra's grace and patience. But marriage did not solve the problem that mattered most. Victoria still could not look at her eldest son without seeing the shadow of what she believed he had cost her. Bertie was given social duties, charitable work, the apparatus of a public life, but he was not given trust. He was not given the red boxes. He was not given the sense that his mother believed he could, when the time came, do what his father had done. He was the Prince of Wales, the most visible heir in Europe, and he operated for decades inside the emotional absurdity of a man trained all his life for a role his mother could not bring herself to believe he deserved. By the time he finally became Edward VII, he would be 59 years old. Vicky's trajectory in Prussia darkened along a different axis. Her marriage to Frederick was genuine. They shared liberal convictions, intellectual ambition, and a belief that Prussia could be reformed from within. But the Prussian court was not Osborne. Bismarck's ascendancy, the wars of German unification, and the conservative political culture surrounding the Hohenzollern dynasty placed Vicky in an increasingly isolated position. An Englishwoman in a court that distrusted England, a liberal married to a crown prince whose liberalism was treated as weakness, a mother whose eldest son, the future Wilhelm II, would grow into a politics she and Frederick found repellent. What Albert had intended as his most brilliant dynastic investment was becoming, year by year, a form of exile. Vicky wrote long, detailed, intellectually serious letters home. She remained devoted to England, but devotion to a country 1,000 miles away is a thin replacement for belonging to the one you live in. Alice, in Hesse-Darmstadt, built a life of extraordinary purpose and quiet suffering. Her marriage to Louis was dutiful, but not deeply companionate. She wrote to friends and family of loneliness, of the desire for real intellectual partnership, of a life that felt useful but not full. She turned outward, toward hospitals, nursing reform, public health, and found in service the structure that private happiness did not provide. She corresponded with Florence Nightingale. She helped establish nursing institutions. She became, in the small Grand Duchy of Hesse, a figure of genuine social conscience, the kind of royal who believed that proximity to suffering was not a threat to dignity, but a condition of it. But the body had its own logic, and the body's logic was cruel. In 1873, Alice's youngest son, Prince Friedrich, called Friddy by the family, was diagnosed with hemophilia. He was 3 years old. That May, playing in his mother's rooms, he fell from a window. The fall itself might not have killed a child whose blood could clot. Friddy's could not. He died of a brain hemorrhage hours later. He was the first of Victoria's grandchildren to die from the condition that had entered the bloodline through Victoria herself, though the mechanism of inheritance was not yet understood. What was understood inside the family was that Alice had lost a son to something she could not see, could not treat, and could not prevent, and that the threat would follow her surviving children into their own futures. Alfred, meanwhile, had done what Alfred always did. He moved. He entered the Royal Navy, rose through its ranks, and in 1867 embarked on a voyage that would take him to Australia, the first member of the British royal family to visit the continent. He was 23, energetic, and as far from the suffocating atmosphere of Windsor as geography allowed. Then, on the 12th of March, 1868, at a charity picnic in the beachside suburb of Clontarf, in Sydney, a man named Henry James O'Farrell walked up to Alfred and shot him in the back. The bullet lodged near his spine. Alfred survived, but the incident sent a shockwave through the family and the empire. A royal prince, the Queen's second son, shot at close range on the other side of the world. It was a reminder, sharp and physical, that distance did not mean safety, and that Victoria's children, wherever they went, carried targets as well as titles. Helena married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein in 1866 and settled into a life organized around service rather than spectacle. She worked with nursing organizations, became involved with the British Red Cross orbit, and built a career of institutional competence that was vital and largely invisible. She was the daughter who solved problems rather than creating them, and if that sounds like a compliment, it is also a description of a life in which the solving never stopped, and the recognition rarely came. Louise, by contrast, pushed against the boundaries more openly. She studied sculpture at the National Art Training School, exhibited her work, and in 1871 married the Marquis of Lorne, a commoner by royal standards, the first time a daughter of the Queen had married outside the circle of European royalty in centuries. It was a statement, and Victoria resisted it before eventually conceding. Louise would not become a conventional royal wife. She would become an artist, a public figure in her own right, and a woman whose independence was purchased at the cost of a marriage that brought its own private difficulties. Arthur followed the path of least resistance, or rather, the path that happened to run in the direction his nature already pointed. He joined the army, excelled, and carried the approval of his mother like a medal that never needed polishing. Of all the children, Arthur was the one whose inner life seemed most aligned with the outer expectations. Whether that alignment was temperament or performance is a question the sources do not fully resolve, but Victoria loved him with an uncomplicated warmth she extended to almost no one else, and Arthur accepted that love without the resentment or guilt that attended it in his siblings. Leopold's struggle was slower, less cinematic, and in some ways more painful for its ordinariness. He was bright, he wanted to study, he went to Oxford and found there a world of ideas, friendships, and autonomy that felt like the life he had been designed for. Except that his body disagreed. Every journey was a risk. Every stumble carried the possibility of a bleed that could not be stopped. Victoria's response was to tighten the circle. Fewer trips, fewer permissions, fewer of the ordinary freedoms that his brothers took for granted. Leopold pushed back. He wanted to be treated as a man, not a patient. The negotiation between his desire for independence and his mother's terror of losing him became one of the family's defining quiet battles. Never dramatic enough for headlines, never resolved enough for peace. And Beatrice grew up. That sentence should carry more weight than it appears to, because growing up, for the youngest child of a widow who had reorganized her entire existence around the need for proximity, was not a passage toward independence. It was a narrowing. Victoria had decided, without ever quite declaring it, that Beatrice would remain at her side, not as a daughter preparing for her own life, but as a companion, a secretary, a presence. Marriage for Beatrice was not discussed. The subject was understood to be closed. She was 20 years old, then 22, then 25, and still living in the airless intimacy of her mother's household. Her future, a mirror image of her mother's past. A woman defined entirely by her relationship to someone else's grief. By the late 1870s, the family's trajectories had diverged so completely that the only thing holding them together was the name itself. Vicky was politically stranded in Prussia. Bertie was socially triumphant and emotionally unforgiven. Alfred was a naval officer with a bullet scar and a restless marriage. Helena and Louise had each built lives that worked on their own terms, but remained, in Victoria's eyes, insufficient substitutes for the family Albert had envisioned. Arthur was soldiering. Leopold was fighting for air. Beatrice was suffocating in plain sight. And Alice who had nursed Albert, who had nursed Friddy, who had nursed the loneliness of a marriage that never quite met her, was in Darmstadt, holding her family together through another winter. In November of 1878, diphtheria entered the household. It began with Alice's eldest daughter, Princess Victoria, who fell ill in early November. Within days, it spread. To Alice's other children, to her husband Louis, moving through the family with the indiscriminate thoroughness of a disease that does not recognize rank. Alice nursed them. She moved between sick rooms, managed doctors, held her children through the fever and the choking membrane that gave the disease its name. She had done this before, not with diphtheria, but with the posture of a woman who believed that presence in a sick room was not a choice but an obligation. She had learned it at Windsor, at her father's bedside, 17 years earlier. On the 16th of November, her youngest daughter, Princess Marie, died. She was 4 years old. Alice, exhausted, grieving, still nursing the rest of her family, made a decision that later accounts would treat as the moment the disease reached her. She told her son Ernst, who did not yet know his sister had died, the truth, and in doing so embraced him. Whether the infection passed in that embrace or had already taken hold is medically uncertain. What is certain is that within days, Alice herself was ill. The calendar moved toward the 14th of December. In Darmstadt, in the new palace, in rooms that had been sick rooms for weeks, Alice grew weaker. The woman who had spent her adult life converting other people's suffering into her own purpose was now the patient, and the date approaching was the one date in the year that Victoria's family could never pass through without feeling the old wound reopen. December the 14th, Albert's death, 17 years to the day. The daughter who had nursed the father was dying, and the date knew it. Princess Alice died in the early hours of the 14th of December, 1878, at the new palace in Darmstadt. She was 35 years old. The details of those final hours carry the weight of everything the family had been and everything it would become. The palace by then was not functioning as a palace. It was a convalescent ward with corridors, a house in which curtains stayed drawn and footsteps were muffled, and the air carried the particular staleness of rooms where illness has settled in and will not leave. Alice had been failing for days. The diphtheria that had moved through her household with such methodical cruelty, taking her children one by one into fever, taking Marie permanently, had reached the one person in the family who had never, in her adult life, allowed herself to be the one who was cared for. She was the nurse. She was the one who sat at bedsides. She was the one who stayed. And now she was lying in a room where others sat beside her, and the reversal was as disorienting as the disease itself. Her husband Louis had recovered. Most of the children had recovered or were recovering. But Alice's body, worn down by weeks of nursing, by grief, by the accumulated exhaustion of a woman who had been running on duty since she was 18 years old, did not have the reserves to fight what had entered it. The doctors attending her understood that the prognosis was poor. The family understood it too, in the way families understand things they cannot yet say aloud. Through silences, through the quality of attention in a room, through the particular tenderness that arrives when people begin to behave as though every ordinary gesture might be the last one. Later accounts, passed through family correspondence and Victorian-era retellings, preserve the detail that Alice's last whispered words were "Dear Papa." Whether those words were spoken exactly as later transmitted, or whether they were shaped in the retelling by a family that needed the symmetry to mean something, is not something the surviving evidence can fully resolve. What is not in dispute is the date, the 14th of December. The same day, 17 years earlier, that Prince Albert had died at Windsor, with Alice at his side. The daughter who had held her father's hand at the end now died on the anniversary of that ending, as though the calendar itself had decided to close the circle. The news reached Victoria by telegram. She recorded her reaction in her journal with the compressed intensity of a woman for whom grief had become a native language. The loss was not simply the loss of a child, though that alone would have been enough to break most people. It was the loss of the particular child most associated with the original catastrophe. Alice had been the one at Albert's deathbed. Alice had been the one who held the family together in the terrible first months. Alice had been the bridge between Victoria's old life and her new one, the daughter whose presence at the worst moment had given that moment a kind of human witness. Now the witness was gone, and the date on which she died made the two losses feel not like separate tragedies, but like a single wound reopening across nearly 2 decades. For Bertie, the date compounded an already unbearable association. The 14th of December was the day his father had died, the day after which his mother had never fully looked at him without seeing the Nellie Clifton scandal, the letter Albert had written in anguish, The story Victoria had told herself about cause and effect. Now that date had taken Alice as well. The weight of it, the accumulation of grief and blame and memory attached to a single square on the calendar, was something Bertie would carry for the rest of his life, not because anyone asked him to, but because the family had made the 14th of December into a kind of annual reckoning, and each year it grew heavier. For Beatrice, 21 years old and still living in the enclosed world of her mother's household, Alice's death reinforced the unspoken logic that governed her life. The children who left were the children who suffered. The children who went to foreign courts, who married into distant families, who tried to build lives beyond their mother's reach, those were the children the world broke. Alice had left. Alice had nursed. Alice had served. And Alice had died in a sick room in Hesse at 35, leaving motherless children and a husband who would never fully recover. The lesson, if Beatrice was inclined to draw one, was that the safest place was beside Victoria. Whether Beatrice drew that lesson consciously, or whether it simply settled into her like weather, is impossible to know. But she did not leave, not yet. For the wider dynasty, Alice's death carried a significance that would take another generation to become fully visible. Through Alice's surviving children, the hemophilia that had already killed Fridtjof would pass into the royal house of Russia. Her daughter, Alex, would become Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna, wife of Nicholas II, and their son Alexei would carry the condition into one of the most consequential medical and political crises of the 20th century. Alice could not have known this. She died in 1878, decades before the change she had unknowingly set in motion would reach its furthest consequences. But the documentary must feel the thread pulling forward even here, in the sick room, in the December cold, the understanding that what Victoria passed to her children was not only grief and expectation and the impossible weight of a dead man's standards, but something carried in the blood itself, invisible and patient and more destructive than any scandal or estrangement. The years after Alice's death did not bring the family peace. They brought more of what the family had always produced, achievement and loss in roughly equal measure, tangled together so tightly that it was often difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Leopold, the hemophiliac son, continued to fight for the independence his mother was terrified of granting him. He fell in love. He married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont in 1882, and for a brief period it appeared that he might have what so many of Victoria's children had been denied, a life that belonged to him rather than to the family's machinery of remembrance. Their daughter Alice was born in 1883. Their son, Charles Edward, would follow posthumously, because on the 28th of March, 1884, in Caen, Leopold slipped and fell. The fall triggered a brain hemorrhage. He died the following morning. He was 30 years old. There is something about that detail worth sitting with. 30 years old, a man who had spent his entire life negotiating with a body that would not cooperate, who had begged for ordinary freedoms, travel, study, marriage, the right to walk through a room without his mother calculating the risk, dead from a fall in a French resort town. The mundanity of it was part of the cruelty, not a battlefield, not a grand medical crisis. A fall, the kind of accident that happens to anyone, except that for Leopold it was the accident his entire life had been organized around preventing, and it happened anyway, and there was nothing anyone could do. Victoria had now buried 2 of her 9 children and a husband. The mathematics of loss were becoming difficult to hold. Beatrice's chapter turned that same year. In 1884, at the wedding of Alice's daughter Victoria to Prince Louis of Battenberg, Beatrice met Prince Henry of Battenberg, called Lico, and fell in love. She was 27. She had spent her entire adult life as her mother's companion, her mother's secretary, her mother's living comfort. She had watched her siblings marry and scatter across Europe. She had absorbed the lesson of Alice's departure and Alice's death. And now, for the first time, she wanted something for herself. She told Victoria. Victoria's response was silence, not the silence of consideration, but the silence of refusal so total it did not require words. For months, mother and daughter communicated only in writing, passing notes across rooms they both occupied. The absurdity of the arrangement, a measure of how deeply Victoria experienced Beatrice's desire for marriage as a betrayal. Eventually, Victoria relented, but the terms she imposed told the real story. Henry would move into the Queen's household. Beatrice would remain at her mother's side. The marriage would not mean departure. It would mean incorporation, a husband absorbed into the existing structure, his role defined not by his own ambitions, but by Victoria's need to keep her youngest daughter within reach. The wedding took place on the 23rd of July, 1885, at St. Mildred's Church, Whippingham, near Osborne. Beatrice got her marriage. She did not get her freedom, and the arrangement that followed, Henry living in Victoria's household, Beatrice continuing her duties as companion and secretary, the young couple's private life, subordinated to the old queen's emotional requirements, was the family's logic laid bare. Love was permitted, independence was not. Henry died of malaria on the 20th of January, 1896, contracted during the Ashanti expedition in West Africa. He was 38. Beatrice, widowed at 38 herself, returned to the role that had always been waiting for her. She was her mother's daughter again, fully and finally, and she would remain so until Victoria's death. The fates of the remaining children stacked with the grim efficiency of a family that had learned to absorb catastrophe without ever quite processing it. Vicky's husband, Frederick, became Kaiser of Germany in March of 1888. 99 days later, he was dead of throat cancer, and the crown passed to their son, Wilhelm, whose politics and temperament represented everything Vicky and Frederick had spent their lives opposing. Vicky retreated to Schloss Friedrichshof, the house she built near Frankfurt, and lived there in increasing isolation, the brilliant eldest daughter, Albert's intellectual heir, the woman who had been sent to reshape Prussia, now a widow in a country that had no use for her vision. She died on the 5th of August, 1901, less than 7 months after her mother, of spinal cancer, 60 years old. Alfred became Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1893, inheriting the German duchy that had been Albert's family seat. But the inheritance came with its own shadow. Alfred's only son, also named Alfred, died in 1899 at the age of 24, in circumstances the family never fully explained to the public. The young man had been ill. The details were kept private. Alfred Sr., broken by the loss, died the following year, on the 30th of July, 1900, at the age of 55. Victoria herself died at Osborne on the 22nd of January, 1901. She was 81. The children, those who survived her, were released at last from the household their mother had built around a dead man's memory. But release, for most of them, came too late to feel like freedom. Bertie became Edward VII at 59 and proved in the 9 years of his reign that the qualities his parents had mistrusted, sociability, warmth, an instinct for people rather than systems, were precisely what the monarchy needed at the turn of a new century. An age took his name. The public loved him. But there is a particular kind of tragedy in a man who spends 6 decades proving himself fit for a role he was born to hold, and the fact that he succeeded does not erase the decades in which he was not trusted. He died on the 6th of May, 1910, 68 years old. Helena continued her work, nursing institutions, charitable organizations, the steady, unglamorous labor of a woman who had turned duty into identity and never looked back. She died in 1923, 77 years old. Louise outlived nearly all of them, dying in 1939 at 91. The sculptor, the rebel, the daughter who had fought hardest for a self that was not entirely defined by her surname. Arthur, the dutiful son, the military man, the favorite who never seemed to chafe against the role, died in 1942 at 91, the last surviving son of Queen Victoria. And Beatrice, the youngest, the captive, the companion, Beatrice, who had been 4 when Albert died and whose entire life had been shaped by a bereavement she was barely old enough to remember, died on the 26th of October, 1944, at Brantridge Park in Sussex. She was 87 years old. She was the last of the 9. In the years since, the story has been told and retold, each generation finding in Victoria's family the version that speaks to its own preoccupations. The ITV and PBS drama, Victoria, gave audiences the early years. The young queen, the marriage, the first children, with Jenna Coleman in the title role, and found in the love story the warmth that the later decades would strip away. The documentary series Queen Victoria's Children, broadcast on BBC Two, reframed the reign not through policy or empire, but through the 9 lives that radiated outward from it, each one shaped by the same pressures and each one arriving at a different destination. Both are useful not because they are definitive, but because they confirm what the family story has always generated, a compulsion to look behind the official portrait and ask what it cost the people inside the frame. A study published in Science in 2009 identified the hemophilia carried through Victoria's line as hemophilia B, a deficiency of clotting factor 9 caused by a mutation that Victoria either inherited or developed spontaneously. The condition passed through Alice and Beatrice into the royal houses of Russia, Germany, and Spain. Modern hemophilia organizations note that there are no known living members of Europe's current or former reigning dynasties carrying the condition, but the historical impact was vast. A single mutation, traveling through the marriages Victoria and Albert arranged with such care, reaching into courts and nurseries and sick rooms across the continent for 3 generations. What remains, physically, is scattered but present. Osborne House stands under the care of English heritage, its nursery and Swiss cottage preserved, the miniature kitchen, the garden plots, the specimen collections, as though the children might return at any moment to resume the lives their father designed for them. Frogmore Mausoleum at Windsor holds Victoria and Albert together in death as they were in life, the memorial Albert never saw and Victoria visited obsessively. Schloss Friedrichshof survives as Schloss Hotel Kronberg, a hotel now, Vicky's widow's retreat converted into something a paying guest can sleep in. Bagshot Park, Arthur's residence, remains a royal property. The places endure. The people who filled them do not. None of Victoria's 9 children are alive. That is obvious, but it is worth stating plainly, because the story can create the illusion that these lives are still unfolding, still waiting for a resolution that might soften what happened. There is no resolution. There are only the facts, arranged in the order they occurred, and the pattern they make when you stand far enough back to see them whole. The public saw the mother of Europe. They saw the photographs at Osborne, the ordered rows of children, the marriages that connected the British crown to the thrones of Germany, Russia, Denmark, Spain, and a dozen smaller principalities. They saw a family that looked like an empire in miniature, productive, purposeful, expanding. What they did not see was the sick room in Darmstadt, where a woman who had spent her life nursing others died on the anniversary of her father's death. They did not see the son who bled at a touch and wanted nothing more than to be allowed to walk through his life unguarded. They did not see the youngest daughter writing notes to a mother who sat 10 feet away and would not speak to her because she had dared to fall in love. They did not see the eldest son carrying, for nearly 60 years, the belief that his mother blamed him for his father's death. Victoria loved her children. That is not the question. The question is what love becomes when it is fused with grief and refracted through 9 lives that were never quite allowed to belong to the people living them. Alice was 35 years old. It was the 14th of December. The date, by then, had its own gravity. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.